Good morning. Good to see you here. Welcome. Welcome back. You braved the snowy, frosty morning. As I said before, it is whatever is happening in September, October. I don't blame you, Bobby, Bobby's going to help me mold or something. So forgive the tissues and the blowing of the nose. Some of you have that as well. We are looking this morning at Bernard of Clairvaux. You've noticed each week that I've had a few different books, and when this goes out as an audio, which gets sent out by Clearly Reformed, so it's on that website, not the church's website, Clearly Reformed. We have some of the links to these books. So I'm going to be referring to some of these different stories. The letters of Abelard and Heloise, who intersects with the story of Bernard, very famous story. We'll get a little PG-13 in here when we come to this. And then here are some selected writings of Bernard of Clairvaux. This is pretty thick. And then not quite as thick in this Classics of Western Spirituality series, which tends toward a kind of mystical bent, which I don't always agree with, but Bernard of Clairvaux here, and then this book, which with a very strange sort of picture of Bernard, like a little mini Jesus on the cross or something here. So this is a biography. So these are some of the books that I used this week in preparing for Bernard of Clairvaux. How many of you ever heard of Bernard? Well, yeah, okay, all right, some of you. Very good. If you are thinking, you're just wondering, might this be the namesake for the dog, the Saint Bernard? Close, but he's not. Wish that we could, but there's another Bernard actually who's right around this same time period, Bernard of Menthon, who had a way station along the Alps for travelers crossing over the Alps in the 11th century, so right around the same time. So there is a Bernard. The dog is named after him, as they would help Sherpa people across the Alps into France. But not this Bernard, but he is much more well-known and more important, dog lovers notwithstanding. No person in the Western world dominated the 12th century more than this person that most of us have never heard of before, Bernard of Clairvaux. He was renowned in his own day and would be for centuries to come as a preacher, an ascetic, a miracle worker, a mystic, a theologian, a mover of armies and people, a mentor to popes, and a lover of Jesus. Martin Luther called him, quote, the greatest monk who ever lived. Very high praise. John Calvin referenced Bernard more than any other medieval figure, and he cited him in a number of theological disputes, from disputes about the bondage of the will, to predestination, to criticisms of the Catholic Church, as we'll see in a little bit. One of the reasons the Reformers were so keen on Bernard is he had some now this is centuries before the Reformation, but he had very pointed criticisms of the papacy and of the Catholic Church, even though he was a very committed churchman. According to one of Bernard's contemporaries, quote, in Bernard's countenance there shone forth a pureness not of earth, but of heaven, and his eyes had the clearness of an angel's and the mildness of a dove's. Ooh, just feel free to use that for your significant other. I feel like I'm gazing into the very face of heaven this morning. Another early biographer said, the majesty of his name was surpassed by his lowliness of heart. And Luther, again, gave him perhaps the best compliment. Quote, Bernard loved Jesus as much as anyone can. So who was this man that so many spoke so highly of him? And you'll see there's many good reasons to commend him, and as with all heroes, also some clay feet. He was born in 1090 in Burgundy, a region in center-east France, and he died in 1153. Just 20 years and a little bit more after his death in 1174, he was already canonized as a saint. It only took 2 decades. It took a little bit longer for him to be admitted as a doctor of the church. This is a specific honorific in the Catholic Church, one who had significant theological contribution. In 1830, he was admitted as a doctor of the Catholic Church. At that point, the Catholic Church had only admitted 16 doctors by 1830. Now there are 36. So it just got great inflation all over the place. It just got a lot easier to become a doctor in the Catholic Church. Bernard was born into a noble family. He had a knight for his father, and he had a pious mother. The contemporaries and his early biographers tell us he was slightly above average in height, which would have been much shorter than we would be used to. Blonde hair, blue eyes, fair complexion. At age 23, he joined a Cistercian monastery. I'll say more about the Cistercians in just a few moments, but so called because this monastic movement began in Citeaux. Savannah, are you here? Okay, you're going to help with any of the French pronunciation. She will give you French lessons even, in fact. So good to have you here. And Joseph is playing the trumpet, but he can play the trumpet in English and French. So it's very good. Citeaux, we'll say more about them in just a little bit. When the number of the monks at Citeaux got too large, Bernard went with 12 others and he founded a new monastery. They settled in an area which was called Wormwood. It was considered a bitter place, plagued by thieves and robbers, but Bernard and his 12 monks got in with the Chamber of Commerce and they did a great rebranding of Wormwood, and instead they called it Clairvaux, Clear Valley. Valley of Light. Tear down the Wormwood sign. Come on in. Houses available. No houses. They had to build them, but a new monastery here at Clairvaux. As the abbot, remember the abbot is the head monk, at Clairvaux, Bernard became famous for his writing, preaching, miracles, humble, heartfelt piety. And here's another great title. I have to double check the spelling. But since the end of the 12th century, he has been called Dr. Mellifluous because his preaching was like the sweet dropping of honey. That's what it means to be mellifluous. And in the Catholic Church, he is the patron saint of beekeepers and candle makers because you deal with wax and such. Bernard of Clairvaux, Dr. Mellifluous. He was famous for many things, as we'll see. In his own day, perhaps most well known as a preacher, hence mellifluous. His most famous sermons were on, just think, what book would you really make your mark on? Maybe Romans, maybe Exodus, maybe the Gospel. No, for Bernard, it was Song of Songs. He took a very allegorical interpretation to the Song of Songs. He began a series in 1135, and take heart, he didn't finish it, until he died in 1153. So he took some breaks. He was preaching around a lot of different places. It wasn't a weekly sermon series, but he started this 18-year sermon series on Song of Songs, and he died. And then one of his monk pupils took up after him, and then he died, and then they probably just figured, let's not try to continue this anymore. But he considered this the greatest song. What song would you write for the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords except the Song of Songs? So he took a very Christocentric interpretation, saw the Song of Songs as an expression of the church's longing for Jesus Christ. And he said there's lots of great songs in the Bible. There's a song of Miriam, there's a song of Moses, but this is given the epithet Song of Songs. This is the greatest song in the whole Bible. You can still read these books here that I gave, have dozens of his sermons or selections of the sermons from the Song of Songs. He says at the beginning, these sermons are not milk for the novice, but this is meat for my monastic communities and for strong believers. They're full of metaphysics, Trinitarian theology, contemplation, a desire to be mystically one with Christ. When I was in college and seminary, being passed around by tapes at the time was this series by Tommy Nelson, who is a preacher north of Dallas, on the Song of Solomon, and it was all dating advice, and it was just, I mean, especially if you were single, this was just a preacher talked about sex, and wow, it was legitimate, and we could listen to it, and this sermon series is nothing like that. No dating advice. He begins by meditating on, because it starts in one of the first verses about the woman says, I desire to be kissed by the kisses of his mouth. And so he reflects, the mouth which kisses is the word, and the flesh of Christ is the recipient of the kiss. So he likens, like the two lips coming together in a kiss are like the divine and the human nature of Christ coming together. And then he takes this whole metaphor of kissing. What is kissing? But it's the union of souls. So he says this song is about the prophetic longing of every Christian heart to be joined to Christ. When she says, I long, she doesn't say, I long to be kissed. You're not longing to be kissed in some physical way by Christ, but you're longing for the kiss of his mouth. That is, you're longing for the Word made flesh to have a union with Christ. We receive no other than the mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, who with the Father and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, world without end. Amen, he says. He goes on to argue that the progress of the soul takes place in 3 steps, which can be likened unto 3 kisses. The Holy Trinity can be explained with kissing also. The Father kisses, the Son receives the kiss, the Holy Spirit is the kiss. So you get an idea for his allegorical method. What he says in these sermons is orthodox. He was very intent on defending the orthodoxy of the church. Whether or not it's the best way, now there's a long history. In fact, maybe the predominant history in the church is of taking the Song of Songs as an allegory or as speaking to the life of the Christ and the church. And when I did one sermon on this earlier in the year on Song of Solomon, I said, I think that's a fair application, but I don't think that's the first way in which we should read the text. But it was a very popular series and quickly published and influential. He says in another famous work, On Loving God, maybe you've encountered this even in a Western Civ class. Famously in this book, On Loving God, he says there are 2 chief evils which wage war against the soul: love of the world and too much love of the self. And the book is famous for Bernard saying there's 4 degrees of love. 1, man loves himself for his own sake. Now he takes that as a given. He doesn't take, when Jesus says love your neighbor as yourself, today commentators sometimes say, well, that's 2 commands. You need to first love yourself. Jesus was the first treat yourself. That's what he was telling you to do. And then you got to treat your neighbor like you treat yourself. Now, Bernard said, we all love ourselves. That's a given. So the very first kind of love is you love yourself for yourself. Second step, man loves God for his own good. So first, you love yourself for yourself. Second step, you love God, but you love God for what he does for you. 3, man loves God for God's sake. Now you might think, well, isn't that going to be the last step, that you love God for God's sake? But surprisingly, Bernard has a 4th step where man loves himself for the sake of God. And I say, well, that's strange. Is this, again, Bernard saying you really need to love yourself? No, Bernard doesn't mean love yourself in the way that we do. Again, he takes it for granted that you will love yourself. So the highest love is this love you automatically have for yourself is really for the sake of God. So contrary to how we would receive that, some sort of self actualization. Bernard actually says in this final step, we are emptied and almost annihilated. We lose all sense of ourself. We are swallowed up in the divine. He says this belongs to the heavenly realm, and you barely can have even a smidgen of it here on earth. Now, we've already seen the importance in previous classes of Benedict and his rule. These are Benedictine monasteries, for the most part, throughout the Middle Ages. But as would happen, the monasteries would go through typical cycles of very earnest people joining the monasteries, and then over time they would accumulate to themselves patrons or wealth, and they would become lax, and you would have to start the whole cycle over again. In addition, the monasteries in the Middle Ages are just about the only places where you can go to be educated. So if you want to send your son or your daughter to receive some sort of education, you have monasteries. Eventually, you have some cathedral schools as the bigger cities build cathedrals, and they have some schools attached. And then right around this same time, we have the growth of the university. But really, from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West until this time, if you wanted to be educated, you had to send your kids or enroll yourself in a monastery. So it was possible to be at a monastery, to be educated without being a monk. There was a reform movement, and I mentioned the Cistercians. We'll come to them in just a moment. But there was a reform movement at Cluny, the Cluniacs. So this, in 910, was a monastery founded at Cluny, and it became wildly successful. Again, they were saying, we got to go back to the Benedictine rule. We've lost sight of what monasticism was supposed to be about. Well, over time, they accumulated people, and because the monastic communities insisted on frugality, hard work, self-sacrifice, these are the sort of things, even today, we say, well, that generally leads to prosperity. And they had contributions pour in, so they built ornate buildings. They had gold and jewels. They had so much that they didn't even need to work the land anymore, which was a major part of the Benedictine vision, is that we work the land to provide our own food. Well, these Cluniac monasteries become wealthy, and people can come to them, and it's a sort of the monastic life on the country club style. Then you have, all right, the Cluniacs, they've gotten too worldly, and so this new monastery, as I said, in Citeaux, called the Cistercians. Bernard was a Cistercian. If you've heard of today Trappist monks, they're Cistercians. The most famous in 20th century was Thomas Merton, a Trappist Cistercian. In fact, he wrote the introduction to one of the Bernard volumes there, a mystic, not commending to you Thomas Merton's theology, but he's one of these. Founded in Citeaux in 1098, so you can see this is after Bernard is born. So Bernard gets in on the Cistercian thing pretty quickly. The idea was, again, restore the dignity, the simplicity, the austerity of the rule of St. Benedict. They would pray through all 150 psalms each day. They wanted to develop simplicity in architecture, in life, in liturgy. That's what the Cistercians were about. And one of the themes of Bernard's life is to call for the reform of the monastic movement, and there's this on-again, off-again relationship with those who are of the Cluniacs. So, for example, in 1119, so Bernard comes into the Cistercians around 1113 when he's about 23 years old. 1119, he's writing to his cousin Robert. Robert had come with him into the monastery, and now Robert is saying, whoa, the Cistercian thing is too hard. I'm going to go join the cushy life at Cluny. And so Bernard writes to his cousin, quote, if warm and comfortable furs, if fine and precious cloth, if long sleeves, and ample hoodies, I would take the translation, if dainty coverlets and soft woolen shirts make a saint. Why do I delay and not follow you at once? But these things are comforts for the weak, not the arms of fighting men. Here's a great line he says to his cousin. The soul is not fattened out of frying pans. Oh, you're leaving the real monastic life to go down to the cushy Cluniacs. Many monks, of course, pursued asceticism. That was the idea, at least initially. But Bernard took this to the next level. There's a contemporary of his, William of Saint-Thierry, who knew Bernard, who wrote in detail about Bernard's eating habits. It makes for very gastrointestinal reading. People wrote very earthy ways. He said that Bernard ate, quote, not for enjoyment, but only because he was afraid of collapsing. Not true for most of us, I think. He said for Bernard, the intake of food was like torture. You do wonder sometimes, I have celiac, you wonder, did some of these people have celiac? Would they have been diagnosed with an eating disorder? Had they so broken down their body they simply could not take in food? William says Bernard kept meticulous track of everything he ate. If he ever ate more than was normal, he punished himself. And so as a result, he could barely choke down food. And, here's where it gets earthy, William said, when he did choke down food, it either came out with great pain on the one end, or it was regurgitated up on the other end. In fact, early in his time at Citeaux, he had to be quarantined in a hut for a few years because he was so sickly and because he was throwing up all the time. There's a story that he was vomiting so much in the choir. There's some choir members here. He had to bring, the other monks were getting bothered. Bernard, you're just ralphing all the time in the choir. And so he had to bring his own little bucket. Now, that didn't make it a whole lot better, so eventually, time out, just take a break from the choir. It's hard to keep singing. So that's when he gets banished to the hut. So even this guy, William, who loved Bernard, respected him, said, well, what a model, and yet maybe sometimes he took it a little too far. But this life at Clairvaux was considered by many observers to be almost heaven on earth. So here's one contemporary account. It's quite purple prose, some hagiography, but listen to it. This man says, I tarried with Bernard a few days, unworthy though I was, and whichever way I turned, he's at Clairvaux, I marveled and thought I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The golden ages seemed to have returned and revisited the world here at Clairvaux. At first glance, as you entered, after descending the hill, you could feel that God was in the place, and the silent valley bespoke in the simplicity of the buildings, the genuine humility of the poor of Christ dwelling there. The silence of the noon was at the silence of midnight, broken only by the chants of the choral service and the sound of the garden and field implements. No one was idle. In the hours not devoted to sleep or prayer, the brethren kept busy with hoe and axe, taming the wild land, clearing the forest, and although there was such a number in the valley, yet each seemed to be a solitary. It became the example for others to follow. And over the course of his life, Bernard would establish 70 different monasteries. So you think of like church planting. You take, a dozen monks with you. You go somewhere, several miles away. It's hard to travel great distances. And what do? They start clearing out the forests and they build huts. And over time, people come to them and maybe wealth comes to them to try to build up the land and these monasteries. By all accounts, in his day, Bernard was the most influential, most well-known, most well-respected person in Christendom. He received dignitaries at Clairvaux. He was influential sometimes more than the popes, sometimes behind the popes, especially, as we'll see in a moment, one of his monks became pope. He was a mystical theologian, a consummate churchman, reputed for his religious warmth, his love, his humility, his devotion. I've titled this lecture, on your outline, Bernard and the renewal of the church. Because as I mentioned earlier, much of what animated Bernard was a desire to see the church renewed. And so he could be quite scathing in his criticisms of the church, especially the prestige, the wealth, not just the wealth, but that the church and its monastic communities and the papacy were desiring earthly rewards above heavenly ones. In 1129, he wrote to Bishop Alexander of Lincoln, not to love his present possessions, not to let the pleasure of his present property hide his true purpose from him. And then, in 1145, one of his Cistercian monks, who took the name Pope Eugenius III, became pope. So Bernard had been his father, his abbot, but then he's older than him, but then he becomes the pope, and so now this pope, your intern now becomes your father. So he writes to Pope Eugenius in a series of books called On Consideration. Not a very catchy title, but it comes from the work we looked at many weeks ago from Gregory the Great, his book on pastoral rule, that some of the language in there was that the pastor must be full of consideration. That is, to consider his humility, to consider his heart, to consider the good of others. And so he writes to Pope Eugenius because Bernard was not really sure that his disciple was really up to the task of being the pope. And so this work is part theology, part contemplation of the divine essence, and part exhortation. For example, Bernard is writing to the Pope about the sort of challenges he will face and saying, you're going to face challenges that not even the Apostle Paul faced. And listen to what he says in the language that he uses, which suggests these were the sorts of things and people that the Pope would have to encounter. He says, did men full of ambition, avarice, simoniacal, simony is wanting to purchase church office, sacrilegious, keepers of concubines, incestuous, all sorts of human monsters as these come streaming to him, meaning Paul, from all over the world, so that by means of his apostolic authority they might obtain or retain ecclesiastical distinctions? So just do a little mirror reading there. He's saying that's what you're going to face as a pope. You're going to have sacrilegious, keepers of concubines, incestuous people, the scum of the earth, who are coming to you, that you would dole out the patronage of church office. If you were an educated person, you could go toward medicine, not even quite law yet, maybe medicine, but usually the church, that's where you went. How did you have any status in society? It was to have a position in the church. He was critical of the papacy's preoccupation with prestige. He said, honor claims all, holiness nothing or but little. He said, the papacy has become enamored with pomp and ceremony. It's high and mighty when simplicity would be more in keeping with the spirit of Christ. He says, the church has been all about preserving its dignity. Above all else, he urged Eugenius to commit himself to spiritual growth and to be a spiritual influence. So listen to this, and you'll understand why Calvin, for example, cited this passage of Bernard, because this is what the Reformers would deal with when they were looking at the papacy. Bernard says, quote, which of the apostles was a settler of disputes, a fixer of landmarks, or a judge among men? Then here's a great line. Which seems to you the greater dignity and power, that of forgiving sins or that of dividing estates? Because the Pope had been the arbiter of all of these land disputes across the Holy Roman Empire and the British Isles. Later, Bernard says, if you are to do the lesson of a prophet, what you need is not a scepter, but a hoe, a gardening instrument. The prophet does not rise to reign, but to root out weeds. Your role, he says, is apostleship, not lordship. He's very critical of what had too often become the role of the papacy and what the Pope was about in the Middle Ages. Two other events in Bernard's life deserve special mention. His involvement in the launching of the Second Crusade, which we'll come to at the end, and next week we will look in more detail at the Crusades. And the other event to look at is how Bernard's life intersects with a man named Peter Abelard. One of the most famous, tragic, romantic, heretical stories in all of church history. And so I had this, you can get this, it's a big thick book, The Letters of Abelard and Heloise. Maybe you jogging some memory from a Western Civ class, that this has come down to us as these romantic, although it's quite a gruesome and graphic story as well, between Peter Abelard and Heloise. So who is Abelard? Who is Heloise? And what does Bernard of Clairvaux have to do with them? Bernard was a brilliant philosophical thinker. He also had a troubled history. He was given the task of tutoring a precocious young woman named Heloise. Their ages were, when they met, about 35 and 15. So even given the standards of the time, where women would get married at 15 and marry older men, that's still not the gap I'm looking for as a parent. It's clear from Abelard's own telling of the story that Abelard set out to seduce her. Their relationship grew into a love affair. For 3 or 4 years, they had this wild romance, which was something of an open secret. The Abelard, who had much more to lose than Heloise, barely tried to keep it a secret. He wrote songs about her. People in the town square were singing these songs about Heloise. It was an open secret. The uncle, a man by the name of Fulbert, we don't know about Heloise's parents, but she seemed to have been raised and watched over by her uncle Fulbert, was rather naive and foolish and allowed Abelard to have almost complete control over Heloise. Yeah, why don't be her tutor, and you can discipline her when she acts up, and you can just have live in the same house and have the run of things with her. Very foolishly, to leave them unattended day and night. And so here's what Abelard says, and I got some excerpts here. They're a little PG-13. So Abelard says, "We were united first under one roof, then in heart. And so with our lessons as a pretext, we abandoned ourselves entirely to love. Her studies allowed us to withdraw in private as love desired, and then with our books open before us, more words of love than reading passed between us, more kissing than teaching." PG-13 here. "My hands strayed oftener to her bosom than to the pages. Love drew our eyes to look on each other more than reading kept them on our text. In short, our desires left not the stage of any stage of lovemaking untried, and if love could devise something new, we welcomed it." This is in the Middle Ages. People have been people. In 1118, she bore Abelard a son, named him Astrolabe. The uncle, Fulbert, pressured Abelard and Heloise to marry in secret. They both, it seems, had this wrong-headed, almost mystical notion that marriage was beneath ordinary humans. We might say it was kind of a romantic, poetic notion, like, marriage, to put it in anachronistic terms, marriage is for the bourgeoisie. We don't need marriage. We have a freedom of love. Marriage is chains. Fulbert, so they got married in secret. Then Fulbert wanted to make them marry in public. Well, Abelard, well, this is going to be the end of my career, he figured, and whatever else I might want to do. Although it wasn't yet, remember Gregory the Seventh, he was the one who really was pushing at the end of the 11th century clerical celibacy, but it hadn't yet taken hold at every part of the priestly hierarchy. So it's not that to be married per se would have meant he couldn't do anything in the church, but under these circumstances, he figured this is going to be the end of me, the end of my teaching, the end of my theological, philosophical career. So he sends, when the uncle wants them to get married out in public, he sends Heloise to a convent. Fulbert takes this as a sign that Abelard has repudiated the marriage. So he seduced my niece, got her pregnant. Now they're married. He won't do this. He sent her away. He's just casting her aside. And so in his rage, he commissions a group of ruffians to do the unthinkable. Here's how Abelard describes it. At this news, her uncle and his kinsmen and followers imagined that I had tricked them and found an easy way of ridding myself of Heloise by making her a nun. Wild with indignation, they swore an oath against me, and one night, as I slept peacefully in an inner room in my lodgings, they bribed one of my servants to admit them, and they punished me with a most cruel and shameful vengeance of such appalling barbarity as to shock the whole world. What did they do? He says, they cut off the parts of my body whereby I had committed the wrong of which they complained. Men break into his room and they castrate him. As you might imagine, Abelard's life from this point, he didn't die, would be very topsy-turvy. He was a monk, he was a theologian, he established a hermitage, then he leaves that to become an abbot. Heloise and her nuns are expelled from a convent. Abelard, who still has some connections, he's very well regarded as a teacher, he arranges for her to become the abbess. So that's the abbot is the male at a monastery. The abbess is the leader at a convent for nuns, at a convent called Paraclete, comforter, the word for the Holy Spirit. And Abelard then writes these letters. So in this book, letter number 1 from Abelard, as it's labeled here, is actually an autobiography. And this is not the title you want if you're writing your autobiography. A history of calamities is what he called it. And that's what his life was. A history of calamities. So 1118, that was the baby, Astrolabe. This is now 1133, 1138, over a 5-year period. So this is 2 decades later. They're still in love. And they write these letters to each other. Abelard can't bear to forfeit his career. Heloise is trapped in a convent. She says, you can see why these letters are famous. One, they're very interesting. And from a modern view, they seem so modern, even though they're taking place here in the 1100s. But they're like a Romeo and Juliet. They're absolutely tragic, but heartfelt. Heloise says, God knew I never sought anything. She's writing to Peter Abelard all these years later. I never sought anything in you except yourself. I wanted simply you, nothing of yours. As I said, they have this ideal that marriage was something beneath them. She believed that it was a kind of chains. And she says here, this is an especially famous line in her letter to Abelard, all these years later. God is my witness that if Augustus, emperor of the whole world, thought fit to honor me with marriage and conferred all the earth on me to possess forever, it would be dearer and more honorable to me to be called not his empress, but your whore. I don't know if to marvel, to feel sorry for her. It's just absolutely tragic. She says of all women, she was most wretched, Of all unhappy people, she was the unhappiest. To be his lover was to be highly exalted, and they had reached such heights of love, she says, that now the fall of it has made for the deepest suffering. She was tormented in her conscience. Quote, "Men call me chaste, they do not know the hypocrite I am." She says, "I only entered the convent not even to please God, but to please you, Peter." She says, "I've done everything in my life not to offend you instead of not to offend God." And all she can think of is their love affair. Quote, "Wherever I turn, they are always there before my eyes, bringing with them awakened longings and fantasies which will not even let me sleep." She says, "When I should be praying, I see these visions of us together at confession. I'm not groaning over my sins, but I'm lamenting the love that we lost at Mass." She says, "I'm having dreams of being with you." Quote, "Everything we did and also the times and places where we did it are stamped on my heart along with your image, so that I live through them all again with you. Even in sleep, I know no respite." They exchange these series of letters together, still deeply in love with each other, but the ultimate star-crossed lovers who could not be together. Abelard is famous for this affair, this relationship with Heloise. I suppose it's not an affair, but sex before marriage and then married. But he was a gifted teacher and a very influential thinker. And many people wonder just what ideas he may have gotten from Heloise, that she was the fact that she's writing these very fine letters when hardly anyone's literate, let alone women, shows her mental prowess and also her level of education. So after Abelard was emasculated, he withdrew into monastic retreat, and he gathered a large following. He was a very gifted teacher. He wrote a number of books, the most famous of which, in Latin, is called Sic et Non. Yes and no. He looked at 158 theological categories, and he showed how the church fathers and even the Bible gave contradictory answers that did not agree. So he was a forerunner of some of this rationalism, skepticism. Now he would have probably said, "Look, I'm not saying. I'm just saying. I'm just kind of putting it out there. Look at yes and no. Church fathers, Bible, lots of ways in which they do not agree with each other." Abelard, you might say, for better or worse, more worse, I would say, was ahead of his time. He questioned everything. He pursued reason. He was critical. He was doubtful. He could be arrogant. He got himself into all sorts of trouble. He played around at the edges of orthodoxy in his day. People were concerned that he was in error concerning the Trinity, concerning the doctrine of Christ, concerning the atonement. That's a lot of things to get wrong or be suspected of getting wrong. One of the main issues was his view of the atonement. Now remember last week with Anselm helps to articulate a satisfaction theory of the atonement. That the atonement is a sacrifice by the Son, not offered to Satan, but offered to God for the satisfaction of his honor. One of the keys in Anselm's theory, it's more than a theory, we think it's biblical, is that the atonement is objective. The atonement objectively accomplished something. There was a problem. There is a sin of dishonor from humanity to God. And in order for that dishonor, that debt to be paid for, something objective must happen, Christ's death on the cross. Abelard's view is something which today theologians call moral influence theory. And you can still find liberal theologians who go back to Abelard and say, hey, I'm just saying what way back in the Middle Ages Abelard said, moral influence. So his view is that instead of being objective, the cross was only subjective in what it accomplished. Now, we would say there was also a subjective element. Of course, yes, the cross shows how much God loves us. That's biblical. But he said, no, not this satisfaction theory of Anselm, that's not going to work. It's a moral influence. What the cross accomplished, it's not that God's anger or justice needed to be satisfied. He was already loving towards us, and this was to show how much he loved us, that therefore we would be influenced by his love to turn and love others. Bernard. So let's bring this back to Bernard. Bernard accused Abelard of heresy, and he brought charges against Abelard at the Council of Sens in 1141. Depending on which side you were on, Bernard either rigged the council against Abelard. It was supposed to be maybe something of a trial or a disputation, but Bernard had sent Abelard's works and his refutation to the bishops ahead of time. And so you can either say, well, that's just Bernard doing his homework and being shrewd, or you could say, well, Bernard rigged the thing before it even happened. It wasn't a disputation. It was bound to be a sentencing. And in fact, he was sentenced. Pope Innocent II, the Pope at this time, condemns Abelard to perpetual silence. So his views are found to be heretical. He dies then, Abelard, in 1142. Now, the story with Abelard and Heloise is not quite over, because he had been protected by someone who also deserves mention, but we don't have time, Peter the Venerable, nice to be the Venerable, who was the abbot at Cluny. So again, there was this, remember the Cistercians, the Cluniacs, but what kind of relationship Peter and this Peter the Venerable and then Bernard, again, kind of an on-again, off-again relationship, but Peter the Venerable had provided some protection for Abelard. And at his death, he arranges for Abelard's body to be brought to Heloise. And so Abelard is buried there at the convent of the Paraclete, and she lives another 20 years, dies in 1164, and is buried next to Abelard. Bernard and Peter Abelard were a clash of opposites. In some ways, you could even say the old world and a new world that was coming. Bernard defended orthodoxy, Abelard questioned it and dabbled at the edges. Bernard was known for his piety, his humility, and his godliness. Abelard was not known for any of those things. He was famous for this love affair with a teenage girl. Bernard was sincere, Abelard was brilliant. Bernard was always gaunt and sickly. Abelard, he says in his own biography, was quite strikingly handsome. And he probably was. Bernard had friends and supporters all across the Western world. Abelard had very few. But you might say that times were changing, and it would not be long before the universities across France would be more encouraging of Abelard's way of thinking than Bernard's. Bernard issued a famous statement in his dispute with Abelard, quote, "The faith of the righteous believes, it does not dispute." You can take that as, well, we do want to learn things, but on the whole, okay, yeah. That's very different than sic et non, very different than the method employed by Abelard. The love affair between Abelard and Heloise would be celebrated in the centuries ahead as the best kind of love. And it's in some measure of our day that Bernard would really be cast as a villain. What was Bernard's love? See, when our world thinks of love, the chief love, sometimes the only kind of love, is romantic love. Passionate, against all odds, whatever the world is telling us to do, we're just so deeply in love with it. That's the kind of love that our world would celebrate, Peter and Heloise. Well, what was Bernard's love? It was a love of order, a love of discipline, a love of tradition, a love of the truth. These are the things that over the centuries to come, the world would discount as love, and Peter and Heloise would live on in great passion. In fact, later during the French Revolution, so these are all Frenchmen and women. During the French Revolution, the bones of Bernard were discarded and the remains of Peter Abelard and Heloise were made very sure to be transported and moved and kept safe. It says something about what had happened by the time of the 1790s. Bernard, no longer, but Abelard and Heloise. This is the essence of true love. Now, very quickly, because we will talk about the Crusades next week, I want to say something about Bernard's involvement in the Second Crusade, and then wrap up again with just some things, some reflections, and lessons to learn. Already in 1128, Bernard established something which you've probably heard of, lots of conspiracy theories about it, the Knights of Templar. He wrote a book, and he commissioned this new monastic order. And he said, in a famous line, "Are they monks? Are they soldiers?" He said, "They're both. They are monkish soldiers." This is a new order. And so many historians wrestle with, how do you get Bernard, whose most famous series is the Song of Songs, and he's all about this mystical contemplation and love of God, and yet there's this militaristic side of him. And rather than saying, well, he was just a contradiction, it's better to say, well, it must have made sense in his century, in his time, even if many from today would say, how could those things go together? He was put upon by the Pope to preach a sermon that would launch the Second Crusade. So the Second Crusade is usually dated from 1145 to 1149. This is in March of 1146. Initially, he's reluctant, but once he agrees to do it, he throws himself into the work wholeheartedly. And he preaches a sermon in Vassilies on March 31, 1146. It was a kind of, we would say, revival atmosphere. They had no building that was large enough to hold the crowds. They had to go outside. They had to build a wooden platform and raise them up so he could speak to the multitudes. And it was an incredibly effective sermon. And from there, he toured around Europe and continued to preach in town and in village, calling people to this crusade. Now, in his mind, it was part a pilgrimage. You're going to go to the Holy Land. It was part humanitarian relief. Our brothers and sisters in the Eastern Church are suffering. And it was part a reclamation of Christian lands. Bernard had this great love of Jerusalem, the place where Jesus himself walked. And we'll say much more about the Crusades next week. And certainly, there were huge mistakes. And on this Second Crusade in particular, the Christians behaved themselves terribly. But in Bernard's mind, he was thinking, relief, pilgrimage, these are the lands that belong to the Christians. And so he set out with all of his might. He said that his preaching was so effective. He wrote to the Pope that you could go throughout the towns and you would find 7 women for every man there, because all the men had signed themselves up to fight in the crusade. Monks were leaving their monasteries that they might join this crusade. In a fateful move, Bernard said, well, even if, he said, I call on thieves and murderers and idolaters and adulterers to come and to participate in this crusade, and your sins will be forgiven. Well, he wasn't calling them to do those things, of course, but what he didn't seem to reckon is that when the adulterers and the idolaters and the thieves and the murderers and the robbers join your crusade, they're still adulterers and thieves and robbers and idolaters and murderers, and that's how they behaved. The Second Crusade was an absolute abject failure in every way. You could say everyone in the crusade failed except Bernard's preaching, which was too effective. He didn't contemplate that. Here's one of the insights, I think, and helpful for us. Bernard, this sometimes happened with people who reach great spiritual heights. Bernard just thought that everyone would be as pure and sincere and disciplined and orderly and godly as he was. And of course, no one was. The delinquents who signed up for the Crusades seeking some adventure and some plunder were still delinquents. And you know what? The French and the Germans who went out, they didn't like each other, and they fought the whole way, even though they were supposed to be on the same side. He persuaded leaders throughout the Holy Roman Empire to unite behind this effort. He was, and this is maybe important to note, especially with the events yesterday in Israel, Bernard was far kinder to the Jews than many others of his day. Remember, Charlemagne was tolerant toward the Jews? Well, under the Gregorian reforms in the 11th century, there was a new zeal, and often that came with it a persecuting zeal from the Christians toward the Jews. But Bernard was different. There was an evil priest named Raoul. He was a Cistercian, just like Bernard, a former monk, and he made it his mission during the crusade he called upon Christians in the Rhineland to kill as many Jews as they could. Bernard intervened, and in fact, even in his day, one of the Jewish rabbis said that they would have been slaughtered were it not for the holy man Bernard, who intervened and called off this attempted slaughter. Much of what took place, you could have said, was a humanitarian effort to help the hurting, the sick, and yet by the end, it had been a colossal failure. The Christians, so-called Christians, had behaved themselves very badly, and the whole thing was a military failure, a religious failure, a political failure, and yet at the end of his life, Bernard was ready to call up a third crusade. How should we then, can you hit the number 1 there and just turn that back on? They're on a timer, I guess. Almost out of time. How should we finally assess Bernard? Thomas Merton, who I mentioned earlier, says in his introduction, quote, Bernard contained in himself the whole 12th century. And that's not a bad way to summarize Bernard. Everything that was good, bad, and ugly about the 12th century is contained there in Bernard. So 1, on the negative, we see that all the monastic system could do with its beauty, its buildings, its liturgy, its education, its discipline, we see it still in itself could not tame the human heart. You could take people out of the world, but you couldn't take the worldliness out of people. And so there's a constant need for renewal in the church. That's how it's always been. You also see the possibilities of asceticism. It gave great spiritual dignity to someone like Bernard. I mean, even today, you follow, wow, this person they sacrifice, they are lowly of heart, and yet we can see his punishing of his body. You wonder how many of these people we've looked at so far might have been able to live a few more years. Calvin did literally work himself to death. There was a punishing asceticism. 2, as I mentioned, he called people to a task that assumed people could be the absolute best version of themselves when people rarely are. He figured each crusader would take up the cause with a faith and a zeal as pure as his own. He did not take people as they really were. That was one of the faults. A third, we see in Bernard this constant struggle for who was in charge. Is it the Pope? Is it the Emperor? Is it the king? Which kingdom? Which emperor? Which pope? Even in Bernard's day, the only reason that Pope Innocent II was the pope was because Bernard backed him. There was another man, Analectus II, who was declared to be pope. There's this constant jockeying for power and schism. But on the whole, as we close here, recall Luther's praise that no one loved Jesus more than Bernard. Maybe a little over the top, but we can understand why the Reformers and why almost everyone else in Christendom so loved Bernard. I mean, if you would have gone around in the Western world in the 12th century, for or against Bernard of Clairvaux, I mean, 99% approval rating. People loved Bernard. 3 quick thoughts. One of the overlooked attributes that occurred to me this week of almost everyone we've looked at, even when they died relatively young, even though most of them, because they were monks and for other reasons, had a very sickly constitution, if you notice, almost everyone has had an almost irrepressible energy. That is one of the reasons we're still reading and studying these people, is though they were sick, they just kept going, they kept pressing, they kept writing, they kept speaking, they kept doing whatever their bodies would allow them to do, and that was the case with Bernard. Second, we see in Bernard the personal virtues of sincerity, discipline. You could never, he made mistakes, but you could never say that he was a hypocrite or insincere or a man of worldliness. And then finally, third, he is reputed as the theologian of love, especially love for God. This is really pulling on the memory banks of your literature or Western Civ class to remember Dante's. So he had the Inferno, that's hell, that's the more famous one, but Paradiso in the Divine Comedy, that is the ascent in paradise. Anyone remember who's Dante's guide and companion for most of that? Another famous woman? Oh, Virgil's earlier, but in Paradiso is Beatrice. No, Virgil is there, so 3/4 credit. Beatrice leads him up all the steps except to the beatific vision itself. And that's where, who does Dante choose? Okay, who could lead me to the beatific vision? It's Bernard. And there he sees, quote, the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Bernard says in one of his books, I think it's on the love of God, he says, "You asked me why we should love God and how much we should love him. I reply that we should love God because he is God, and that the measure of our love should be to love him without measure." A number of hymns, you may not have realized, have been ascribed to Bernard. It's hard to tell. You know, a way to get your hymn some playtime is to ascribe it to somebody like Bernard, but think he wrote these hymns. You know them. Jesus, the very thought of thee, Jesus, thou joy of loving hearts, and most famous, O sacred head now wounded. And this verse is a fitting summary of Bernard's life and ministry. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love to thee. Written by Bernard of Clairvaux almost a full millennia ago.